Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, sometimes as we read the Bible, it's a little bit difficult to understand, for example, how the Old Testament fits with the New Testament. And where can we find, if anything, Jesus and the apostles who we find in the New Testament? Do we have any evidence of them coming in the Old Testament? And those are important questions, and we're going to try to answer those the first hour. We'll get back to the news cycle in the next hour, but this is a chance for us to look at theology and apologetics, as we do so often here on Point of View. And even as I've been teaching in my Sunday school class on the book of Hebrews, I've argued that you really cannot understand the book of Hebrews in the New Testament without understanding the Old Testament. And in so, we spend time looking at Melchizedek and whether or not that's a type of Christ. And so those are some of the things we're going to be talking about today because of this new book by David Limbaugh, the Emmaus Code, Finding Jesus in the Old Testament. He's a lawyer, national syndicated columnist. He's been on the program with us before as we've talked about one of his other books, Jesus on Trial. And in the past, we've talked about lots of political books like Crimes Against Liberty and Persecution and many more. But today we're going to focus on trying to understand the Old Testament. And David Limbaugh, a delight to bring you back to Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, so much for having me.
You've been a busy person. I've heard you on some other shows, and I appreciate you giving us some time today here on Point of View. And you say early on in the book that you really enjoyed writing that book, Jesus on Trial, which I would highly recommend to people that want to know how to defend the Christian faith. This one's a little bit different, but it's still kind of in that genre in that you're really helping Christians understand the Old Testament and how the Old Testament fits with the New Testament, and the fact that you really can see, if not always directly, certainly indirectly, the image of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament.
Yes, I came to faith largely through apologetics and mostly by way of the Old Testament. And I was blown away by the Messianic prophecies. And so I learned early on that the Old Testament is Christ-centered. And I even started a book 20 years ago called Roadmap to the Cross.
Yes.
It was an Old Testament summary and kind of an Old Testament primer. And I got about 3 books in, and I submitted it to an agent, and they said, you know, you don't have the credentials to do this. So I just kind of abandoned it. So this is the completion of a project in a sense that I began 20 years ago. And I think I show how the many ways, the 10 or 11 or 12 different categories of ways that Christ is pointed to in the Old Testament.
And again, I think we might just encourage people to take the book and read it in its careful delineation. Individuals that have endorsed it are all sorts of people that have been on this program, like Josh McDowell and Richard Land and Frank Turek and others. And before we get into some of those specifics about the pre-incarnate Christ or the Christophanies and things like that, let's just talk about the Old Testament, because you do a pretty good job of helping us understand that in one sense, the Old Testament is a deliberately incomplete book. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, well, the Old Testament was mostly God's dealings with his chosen nation of Israel. First he created man and all of us. And then I kind of look at Old Testament as the whole Bible as an hourglass. He was dealing with all of mankind at creation. Then early on in chapter 12 of Genesis, and Genesis is 50 chapters, so chapter 12 of the first book, God established the nation of Israel through Abraham, and he tells him that he will make a great nation out of him, that he will bless that nation, that he will give the land to them as an everlasting possession, and that he'll bless all people through that nation. And so he then later, by giving Moses the law, sets apart Israel as a nation of priests who will mediate ultimately the gospel to all of mankind. The Messiah comes through them. They are repositories of the law. They lead instructive lives, and God's dealings with them in the Old Testament are exemplary, show us God's character, how he responds to obedience and disobedience, why he commands that there be no other gods before him, that he is the only God, and that you must not pursue false idols. And so he takes us all the way through that history, and then finally in the New Testament, it branches out again to all of mankind, where Jesus' promise of salvation through faith in him is available to us all. So, but in the Old Testament points us to Christ, as Paul says, it is the guardian leading us to Christ. The law was never intended, nor could it have provided salvation. The law is God's holy standard. There's nothing wrong with the law, but that's not its purpose. Was to show us how inadequate we are apart from God, and that we need, and that we cannot save ourselves by our own merit, by our own works, by our own bootstraps. We have to be saved by the finished work of Jesus Christ and his spilled blood on the cross. So the Old Testament is foundational because it shows us the depravity of our condition and our desperate need for a Savior. But it is absolutely essential because it does show us who we are, and it shows our dealings with Israel, and it points to Christ in shadowy form and shows us that promise of redemption that God instituted all the way back in chapter 3, verse 15 of Genesis. That's the first promise of the gospel. Right when he was administering judgment upon Adam and Eve, he promised the gospel. So we have a God of infinite grace and judgment. God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. Jesus is not all, namby-pamby kind of guy that's milquetoast, that's indifferent to sin. He is the same God. He is one of the three persons of the triune Godhead that is the same God of the Old Testament, although his triune form is revealed and just suggested in shadowy form in the Old Testament. And it all fits together, and it's a marvelous work. It's an inspired work, the Bible, and it's kind of like, you can talk about God could have given us an essay. He could have just sent us an issue paper stating his character and all we need to know about systematic theology. Instead, he revealed himself to mankind through his direct dealings with mankind in the Old Testament, and then incarnate in the New Testament. And in the process of intervening in history with human beings, he also caused those human beings to record that history so that it would be available to us as his revelation. So we learn his revelation through the historical recordings and theological messages that are contained in the Old and New Testament. And it is, to me, it's a mind-blowing thing. And once you study it and you see how integrated it is, how united and unified the Bible is, your faith will be enhanced immeasurably.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, continue our conversation with David Limbaugh of the Emmaus Code. I've looked at all of it, and there's 400 pages, so it took quite a while, and it has been just a very rich study of history. And we're going to come back and talk a little bit more about Old Testament history and biblical covenants. Then we're going to look at, as he does in the book, every particular Old Testament book from Genesis to Malachi and how that fits. Might also mention that something we oftentimes talk about on this program, the messianic prophecies of Jesus. There is an appendix that includes all of that as well. And so if you wanted to use that, it's oftentimes a great message during Christmas or other times. Certainly a very powerful argument to your Jewish friends. So lots of great material in this book today. It is published by Regnery. We have information about it, information about David Limbaugh. It's entitled The Emmaus Code, Finding Jesus in the Old Testament. We'll continue with him and a little bit later with you right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Everyone agrees that we need government to regulate various parts of our society. In fact, the Constitution sets forth some of the vital functions for the government. But I also think that most of us believe that there are too many government regulations. Peter Roth, writing in the U.S. News and World Report, puts it this way. Existing regulations are sometimes unnecessary, frequently in conflict, and are enforced by bureaucracies that have lost sight of their original mission. Instead, they seek to ensure the right tickets are punched and the proper boxes are checked, as though they alone can guarantee consumer safety, economic competition, and financial market stability. There is an economic cost we end up paying to comply with all these regulations. Think of the amount of time many of us spend in filling out our income taxes. Now multiply that by hundreds and thousands of hours. You can begin to see one cost of regulation, and that does not even count the number of efficient ways we could produce a product or service if there weren't government regulations preventing a simpler way of producing it. Peter Roth says there's really no way to determine the total annual cost of the regulatory burden. Some groups have tried to get an estimate on the cost, and they have done it in a way that drives the point home to each of us. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the cost of government day. This is the date at which the average American has paid his share of the financial burden imposed by the spending and regulation that occurs at the federal, state, and local levels. That date usually lands in July. In other words, you spend more than half the year working to pay for the cost of taxes and the cost of all regulations. It's time for Congress to study the regulatory burden that regulations and regulators put on individuals and businesses. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today David Limbaugh, author, lawyer, nationally syndicated columnist, and author of this particular book, The Emmaus Code, Finding Jesus in the Old Testament. It is published by Regnery. Look for it in your local bookstore, but we also have information about it and a recent column by David Limbaugh talking about the Emmaus Code and the God Void. David, let's, if we can, get into some of those covenants. You know, the theme of the Bible is certainly creation, fall, redemption. And different covenants that you talk about are really important to understand. And if there's a place where people maybe misunderstand the Old Testament, it is there, because you have different covenants, an Edenic covenant, an Adamitic covenant, Noahic covenant, of course, really Mosaic covenant, and all the rest. Explain this idea of covenants and what that means and how that's really important for a Bible student to really understand.
Yes, and as you mentioned about the creation, fall, and the new birth, some scholars have put it succinctly. The Bible can be summarized, the book of Genesis as a microcosm, or the whole Bible as generation, degeneration, and regeneration. And that's a great way to look at the entirety of the biblical message.
Yes.
Now, the covenants are the process by which God delivers his message and implements his plan of redemption. So, without getting too technical, let me try to explain this. With the Edenic covenant, and keep in mind that these are terms Bible students and theologians have come up with after the fact. The Bible doesn't call these name these covenants, although it does call them covenants in certain places. But the Edenic covenant, let's just start with that. And what's important is what it is, not what its name is. When God created Adam and Eve, he told them that they couldn't eat from the garden of the knowledge of good and evil. They couldn't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And the implication is that if they didn't eat from it, they would live. But if they did eat from it, they would die. He told them they would die, which obviously means if they didn't eat of it, they would live. Well, so it was a conditional covenant. They did eat of it, and they then were going to be punished with physical death and spiritual death. Now, the death wasn't immediate, but they were to die. And so sin entered the world, sin and death, and by way of Satan, by the way, who seduced Eve. So the Edenic covenant, then you have, and this to me is this next one is just so fascinating and so exciting to me, where Genesis 3:15, and I alluded to it a minute ago, the very time that God instituted and implemented his judgment against mankind for sinning, he announced the gospel. It's called the proto-evangelium, another theological term. It's the first messianic prophecy, Genesis 3:15. Now, let me tell you what's interesting. When I first became a Christian, started studying all this stuff and apologetics, I'd see where my now friends Josh McDowell and Norman Geisler and all these guys would say Genesis 3:15 is the first messianic prophecy, and I read it and I said, "What are you talking about, you guys?" That's fine for you guys to talk among yourselves, and you may believe that, but that's trying to find Christ under every rock. And of course, little did I know that they were profoundly correct. That it is an unmistakable messianic prophecy and an announcement of the gospel, because it says God was talking to the serpent, and he tells him that he's going to put enmity, that is hostility, angst, and controversy between him and the woman, and between her offspring and his offspring. Well, who is the offspring of a woman? The only man ever to be born of a woman and not of a man is Jesus Christ. He was born of Mary and the Holy Spirit. Joseph was not his natural father. He didn't have a human father. And so, unmistakably, that verse is pointing to Christ. Miraculously, how did anyone know? That book was written thousands of years ago. That's not some bizarre coincidence, because it also says, God also tells Satan that he will be able to injure Christ's heel, which means a non-fatal blow, but Christ will bruise his head, meaning a fatal blow. Well, here's the fascinating thing. Satan does deliver, and it actually is a physically fatal blow on Christ, but it's only because Christ allows him to. Christ goes to the cross voluntarily and suffers a temporary physical death on our behalf. But then, in the very process of that, the cosmic joke is on Satan, because unbeknownst to him, Christ rises in 3 days and thereby defeats Satan's sin and death, delivering him a death blow. And so the very third chapter of Genesis, we have a promise of the gospel and of redemption. Then you go to the Abrahamic covenant in 12:3, just 9 chapters later, where I mentioned a minute ago that when God sets aside, when he calls Abram out of his land, Ur of the Chaldeans, and says he's going to make a nation out of him, bless him, make a great nation, bless all people through that nation, and he's going to give them the land permanently. So then obviously bless all people through him, and that means ultimately, and I'm just going to tell you the end of the story because there's no point in a short interview. The Messiah is to come through that land, that little tiny Middle Eastern land, the promised land, that those people, Jesus Christ is a descendant of Abraham. He's a descendant of David, so he's a king in the line of David, which is the Davidic covenant, which is later. And so God blesses all people through Abraham's descendants and David's descendants, i.e. Jesus Christ, by the offer of eternal salvation for those who place their faith in him. Then you got the Mosaic covenant, by the way, which was after the Abrahamic covenant and the Adamic covenants, where, here's my point about this, God's grace came first. The promise of salvation through his grace and not by works preceded the law. So then the law comes in not to contradict God's grace and plan of salvation through faith alone, but to set aside the nation of Israel, to establish it as a nation of priests who are given the law so that they can learn how to live holy lives and be fit for God's presence, because they're going to be ministers and mediators ultimately of the gospel. So the rest of the Bible, the Old Testament, traces God's dealings with the nation of Israel, that little tiny nation through whom the Messiah will come. And it shows how God fulfills his promise to allow them to be on the land as their permanent possession. But when they're disobedient, he'll even remove them from the land. And he removed them 3 times during the Assyrian captivity, the Babylonian captivity. Then he restored them. Keep in mind, he restored them under King Cyrus. And this is a fascinating thing. The Persian King Cyrus was predicted by the prophet Isaiah 150 years before he was even born. By name, God says through Isaiah, he will deliver Jerusalem. He will return them to the land and allow them to rebuild their temple, which is exactly what happened by decree of King Cyrus. And they return to the land, and then again they enter into idolatry, on. And so they're removed from the land again in New Testament times in AD 70 AD, and Rome sacks the temple. And listen to this, and you know this, but for some 2,000 years then, the Jews are dispersed from their land, and in 1948, we know historically, this isn't biblical, but in 1948, David Ben-Gurion announces that, cites the prophet Ezekiel when Israel is reformed in its land. No nation has ever been removed and dispersed for more than 5 generations and retained its national identity, much less its national language, and yet Israel did.
Yes.
Amazing. So all that through God promises redemption, and the law is, by the way, our guardian to lead us to Christ under the Mosaic covenant. It was never intended for salvation. It couldn't possibly provide salvation. It is a holy standard that man can't live up to. And by the way, there's a consistency here. Christ, when he was giving his Sermon on the Mount and his other moral standards that he held us to, they were way beyond any human being's ability to fulfill. The reason Christ was saying, you must be perfect as your Father is perfect, well, everybody's reading that and going, what are you talking about? With all due respect, you are the God-man that we worship, but that's just not fair. Well, it is fair because the way we the way we live up to that holy standard is through the finished work of Christ on the cross, his substitutionary death. Don't you just love it?
Yes. Well, I need to take a break, and you know that, so let's take a break. And when we come back, we've worked our way through a few of the chapters in the book, but we'll come back and talk about all roads lead to Christ, portraits, offices, creation, the pre-incarnate Christ, and then how do we see Jesus in some of these Old Testament books. And all of that is part of this new book that's just out called the Emmaus Code, Finding Jesus in the Old Testament. David Limbaugh with us, and we need to take a break. And when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with him. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Visit our website, pointofview.net. You can find out more about David Limbaugh, more about this book, and we've even posted his most recent column that addresses it in passing. All of that available at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back.
Kerby Anderson and Point of View don't have major corporate support. We need your support to continue. As U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert told us recently,
it just scares me to think about that voice of reason, a Christian voice, a wise man. I hate to think about what would happen if your voice were silenced just because the money was not there to stay on the air.
Make a difference starting at just $1 a day, $30 a month, or $65 underwrites 1 minute of our program. 1 minute standing for fiscal responsibility, promoting a sane foreign policy, defending the reliability of the Bible. Please pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Click the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team today. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with David Limbaugh, author of the earlier book, Jesus on Trial, but this book is the Emmaus Code, Finding Jesus in the Old Testament, is published by Regnery. You can certainly find it in your local bookstore, but we have links for you to find it as well on our line, pointofview.net. And, of course, we also have links to David Limbaugh as well as to the publisher, so all sorts of great ways for you to find out about the book. It focuses on certainly how we can see Christ in the Old Testament, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, also an appendix there that goes on for 7 pages of charts on the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament literally fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ in the New Testament. But David, let's, if we can, kind of get into this. All roads lead to Christ. And certainly you talk about portraits and offices, creation, salvation. You talk about titles, typology, prophecy, even some big words like Christophanies. Let's talk about that, because some people say, well, I don't really see Jesus in the Old Testament, but yes, you do. And how do we see Jesus, either as a type or even as the pre-incarnate Christ?
Well, God's, there are several different ways beyond just the messianic prophecies, which a lot of people are familiar with, and the covenants that I just talked about, the major biblical covenants that all point to and find their fulfillment in Christ. You have what I call God's promise plan. Walter Kaiser, Old Testament scholar, talks about God's promise of redemption, basically coursing through all of the Old Testament and into the New Testament. And I think of all of the other Christ-pointing threads as kind of subsets of God's promise plan. You have various gospel portraits where you see pictures of Christ by analogy in the Old Testament. You can look at Noah's Ark, and it only had one door. There was only one way to salvation, just like Christ is the sole way. You must come to the Father through Christ. The Lamb is a portrait of God, the unblemished Lamb. The Old Testament sacrifices that we see in the Jewish law, the Hebrew law. We've got the Passover, where the Passover event and the Passover ceremony, where God told Moses that he was going to kill all of the Egyptian newborn kids, newborn babies, but he was going to spare those of the Hebrews. But the way he would spare them is he was going to send the angel through their land, and they were to kill a spotless animal and apply the blood of that slain animal to their door frame. And when the angel went through, they would spare the firstborn of those families. Well, the interesting thing is there must be spilled blood, living blood spilled for a sacrifice, and it must be applied personally, each individual. So it's not just an indiscriminate salvation. And it points to the New Testament salvation through Jesus Christ, where you must appropriate the finished work of Christ personally. You must receive it. You must accept and embrace Christ as your personal Savior for salvation. So I think that's a very fascinating pointer in that sense. You've got and there's so many more of those kinds of examples. You've got the Old Testament offices of prophet, priest, and king, which were fulfilled in Christ. Moses was the first prophet. He wasn't a writing prophet, but he was God's mouthpiece, which is basically what a prophet is. Some people in lay circles think of a prophet only as a foreteller, somebody who predicts, but they're really more often forthtellers. That is, people who speak on behalf of God and give and deliver messages of things people ought to do. They will be cursed if they disobey and blessed if they obey. And so Moses was the first prophet, but he tells the people that there will be one greater than him who will be the prophet that they need to listen to. Of course, that's Jesus Christ, the one who they ought to listen to. Of course, there's a bunch of intermediate prophets in between, but Christ is the ultimate prophet. Same thing as priests. The Old Testament priests would mediate the sacrifices, but they would have to take an offering, which would be the unblemished lamb, and dedicate it to God and consecrate it to God. But the thing is, they also had to sacrifice for themselves, because they were also part of the fallen human race, and their sacrifices were only temporary, because they couldn't provide total eradication of our sin, just temporary covering. When Jesus came, he was not only the offeror. He was not only the high priest who made the offering, he is the offeree. He is the instrument he is the lamb that sheds his own blood. So he does both, and his sacrifice is once and for all. It is perfect and complete, and after which there need be no further sacrifices, because his is complete, and we find our faith through him. And then we also point to Christ's actions as creator of the universe. People don't realize that Christ was engaged in the very creation of the universe with the Father and the Holy Spirit. We see him as a sustainer of his creation. What makes the Christian God so unique from other fictitious gods, mythical gods, for example, the God of the deists, who Enlightenment thinkers always championed, God, our God, superintends his universe. He takes great care about his universe, and through his sovereign will, he holds us. He cares for each hair on our head. And, the God of the deists was a watchmaker God who just created us and then abandoned us. Didn't even have a plan for salvation, nothing. So I don't understand how that was so attractive to people. But Christ superintends his creation, and even in the book of Job, when Job asked God, why do good people suffer? God doesn't give him an essay. He shows him how great he is and how impotent and inadequate we are. He takes Job on a tour of the universe and shows how he superintends every minute aspect of his creation and just how much he cares. And he leaves Job speechless and in utter complete faith after that, because the key isn't to know about God. And while that's good, and that's why I want to enhance people's knowledge of God, the key is to know God, not to know about God. Now, they're interrelated, but we must keep in mind the real focus is we need to know Christ and have a personal relationship with him by learning his character and learning all about him through the Old and New Testaments. Of course, we have established a relationship, so we understand his character, and it lays a foundation for our relationship, but the ultimate goal is the relationship. And then you have the titles and references to Christ in the Old Testament that New Testament scholars point out through Scripture. The Christ's saving activities in the Old Testament, he helped the Egyptians, not just eternal salvation, but he delivered them from Egypt. He was instrumentally active. We have Christophanies. These are the theophanies where Christ is involved. That is, where God appears as a human being, where Jesus Christ appeared in the Old Testament in his pre-incarnate form. He hadn't been born yet in the New Testament, where he's really a human being, fully human and fully God. This is in the Old Testament. He just appeared as a human being. But that gave us a foretaste of what he was going to be like in his incarnation, and it showed that he's relational. It shows that while we can't look on the Father and live, and we can't see the Holy Spirit because he's Spirit, and he's only ever appeared in material form as a dove, Jesus Christ is a human being we can hold, touch, we can eat with, we can relate to, and have that personal relationship. I think it's marvelous how that we get a hint of that through the Christophanies in the Old Testament, whether it's helping the Daniel's friends in the fiery furnace, that fourth person that let them out. Some people think it's an angel, other people think it's Christ. You have the angel of the Lord striking down 185,000 Assyrians outside of Jerusalem to defend the kingdom of Judah. Then you have all kinds of appearances of Christ. We helped them conquer Jericho when they went across into Canaan, the promised land. There's all kinds of appearances. You mentioned Melchizedek, or maybe you didn't. I think you did.
Yes, I did.
People think that could be a type of Christ or could be a Christophany. Then we go to the types of Christ, where these Old Testament persons, places, things, events, ceremonies point to Christ. You can look at the furniture in the tabernacle where the God did dwell with the Hebrew people. And you look at all the furniture, and it symbolically points to Christ. And I go through in the book and explain how that is. So that is considered typology, where you actually have an event in the Old Testament or a thing that is kind of a shadow, a type of Christ, but it's made perfect in Christ, so that when Christ comes, we can see that God was showing us in shadowy form what Christ was to be like. And so we'll know that when Christ came, hey, that's what he really was talking about. Yes. And it all fits together.
Very
so
good.
we look at it through our New Testament lenses. We're not making this up. This isn't my idea. Jesus is the one who said he was all through the Old Testament. We're just giving the evidence of it through the New Testament lenses. At least 10% of the New Testament is either direct quote or allusions to the Old Testament. So we're lucky. We have a benefit of hindsight.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll look at, just briefly, of course, there are 8 different chapters looking at Christ in every book, from Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, Deuteronomy, all the way to Daniel through Malachi. And it's all part of this book, which is entitled The Emmaus Code. David Limbaugh has been with us. We'll join with him again in just a minute, but we need to take one of those mandatory breaks. Finding Jesus in the Old Testament, The Emmaus Code, is published by Regnery. We'll come back for more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk about the book, The Emmaus Code, with David Limbaugh, who is the author. Finding Jesus in the Old Testament, published by Regnery. And we've talked about the history of God's purpose throughout the Old Testament. We've talked about how all roads lead to Christ. We've talked about Jesus as the prophet, the priest, the king, the creator. David, of course, we have almost half of your book where you spend time taking us through every one of the books of the Bible, and we do see some of those types of Christ. Joshua is a type of Christ and others. But it does seem to me that in just the few minutes we have left, we might just talk about how people can use this book to, as they read the Old Testament, begin for the first time maybe to see the image of Jesus Christ actually in the Old Testament. That
would be one of my ardent hopes, that the first place, this is an Old Testament primer. I want readers to to know that I've got on two of the chapters an overview of the Old Testament history,
right,
where I summarize and outline it and give them a kind of a jump start on what it is, so they'll get that under their belts, and they'll be in a better position, I think, to understand the message when they see the whole history laid out like that. And then you see how all these themes point to Christ and the multitudinous ways, and I think it enriches your understanding of the Old Testament, and thereby you see how it's foundational to the New Testament, how it shows us how desperately we need a Savior, and then how all those threads find their culmination in Jesus, and there are just so many of them. He's the water from the rock. He's the person. You drink from the well, as he told the lady, drink from the well and you'll be thirsty again. You drink from the water of life, meaning him, and you'll never be thirsty again. And like I said, there were the furnishings in the tabernacle, the Exodus as an event, the messianic prophecies all the way through. There are, you've got the priesthood and all the offerings where the sacrificial offerings that are made, the feasts that we have, the Passover feast, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, all those Old Testament feasts, which might be boring if you read them in a clinical way out of context, but if you understand that they all point to Christ, the Old Testament begins to gain a new energy and life, and I think, will be excited as you read this and learn how all these pieces fit together. And then you go back, if you're like me, and once you have learned some of these things, and this isn't me, I'm getting all this information from giants that I've read, and these are mainstream Christians. These are not kooks. This is all legitimate stuff. I don't state more than the facts allow. I don't find Christ under every rock where he isn't there. I only mention these things where it's legitimate, and you will see it as well when you look at it. And I think once you do that, then you go back and read the Bible yourself. There's no Bible teacher, no human being can improve upon the work of God, the Word of God. That's ultimately what you need to do, and that's the goal of this book. And on my previous book, Jesus on Trial, is to enthuse people about the Bible so that they'll go and become steeped in the Word themselves, because that's where the action is.
I might just mention, too, I think your book provides a real antidote and a real corrective to misinterpretation. 40 years ago, one of your friends and my friends, Norm Geisler, wrote a book, Christ, the Key to Interpreting the Bible. Since that book's out of print, I'm going to recommend this, because once you understand, as you point out in the overview, that there are certain books that are historical books, there's certain books that are poetical or wisdom books, certain ones that are prophetic. That gives you a key to accurately interpreting those passages and not make some of the mistakes that have been made throughout church history when people have wrenched a particular verse out of context.
Exactly. And Norm Geisler is one of those giants, and he's a mentor and now has become a friend of mine. And I sent him this book, and I cited that very book that you mentioned, and he sent me a really encouraging email after I sent him my book saying, this is a great book, and this really needed to be done this time, because he understands that I have a different platform than he does. I'm trying to reach the lay public and people who might not otherwise see these kinds of things. When I wrote Jesus on Trial, and it was published, people were thanking me for finally putting an apologetic into print, and I'm saying, do you guys have any clue? There's hundreds of books on apologetics. But it vindicated my whole method, which was I didn't think a lot of people were aware. And so through my book, whoever read it became aware. And I hope in the same way, people will get an idea about the Old Testament and the centrality of Christ to the Old Testament if they weren't otherwise aware. And even if they are, it'll increase their understanding and their awareness of it. People, Catholics and Lutherans and others, have said to me, well, you act like you came up with this idea, and you shame on you. You plagiarized. This is absurd. We've been saying this for years. I said, read the book. I never said that. In fact, I attribute this idea to Christ. You didn't come up with it either. Christ told the disciples on the way to the Emmaus Road. This has been Christian orthodoxy for thousands of years since it existed, And I am just trying to put it all together. I haven't seen a book, with all humility, that puts it all together. Most books are subspecialties. They take one strain or two strains, the prophecies or the covenants or whatever. I tried to put it all together in a comprehensive, accessible book. And whether I succeeded, I don't know. But that was my goal, is to put it all together to bowl people over with the evidence. I just want to, maybe that's just my mode, but I just think there's so much evidence and so much proof of Christ, of the inspiration of the Bible and its integration and unity and its wonder, that I want to put it all there together and let people then decide for themselves and to profit from it like I have.
Well, again, let me just recommend a couple of books. If you have a friend that's maybe a little bit of a skeptic, I would say that a book that you might give them as a present is Jesus on Trial. If you got especially somebody that maybe knows a little bit about the Old Testament, might be Jewish or might just know a little bit about it, maybe studied in a Religion 101 class, this book, The Emmaus Code, Finding Jesus in the Old Testament, would be just a great conversation starter. So, David Limbaugh, I appreciate the fact that you've taken some time to move away from politics and law to get into theology and apologetics, and I consider those books great resources. And again, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kirby, thank you so much. You're a great interviewer because you know so much more than your subjects, me anyway, and I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. We'll do it again. Let me encourage you to get some of the resources here, and you might, for a few minutes, want to go to our website, pointofview.net. First of all, you can click on his picture, and that will take you to the website there, which is davidlimbaugh.com, so you can find that pretty simply. We have a possibility there for you to order the book. Of course, you might be able to find it in your local bookstore. It's going to be a bestseller, no doubt about that. And then he wrote an article a while back. It's one of his columns called The Emmaus Code and the God Void. And so if you'd like to read one of the columns by David Limbaugh, that is there as well. Of course, you're very familiar with his brother Rush Limbaugh as well. And so those are some resources that we've made available on our website, pointofview.net. Let me also encourage you to take the time maybe to download this podcast and pass it on to some others. And they might say, I had no idea. I didn't know that you could find the image of Christ in the Old Testament. I've always sort of felt I'd only want to read the New Testament. And so, again, we have some of those resources available to you on our website, pointofview.net. Now, let me just mention that the next hour, we're going to come back to the topic about the Syrian refugees. We're going to have Faith McDonnell with us. She has written a very good piece that we've posted on our website. U.S. Christian groups are prioritizing Muslim refugees over Christian ones. Here's why. And it's a bit of a scandal. Of course, we've also had Ben Shapiro saying, no, it's not un-American to prefer Christian refugees to Muslim refugees. So we've got all sorts of things to talk about in the second hour. And if you'd like to join the conversation, we encourage you to do so. Lots of things to talk about. And if you would like to certainly address have done before, open up the phones. But let's take a break. We come back, we're going to talk about this issue of the refugee crisis and why is it so few Christian refugees have made it to the United States. We'll talk about that right after these messages.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your health care. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical health care. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to talk about the refugees, and in particular focus for a few minutes on this issue of the Christian refugees. We talked about how very few Christian refugees from Syria have made it to this country. How many more are Muslim? It's like 2,000 to 50 in round numbers. And there are some very good reasons for that. And we mentioned this article yesterday. We've posted it today. It is written by our guest. U.S. Christian groups are prioritizing Muslim refugees over Christian ones. Here's why. It appeared in the stream. We've posted it on our website, pointofview.net, and it's written by Faith McDonnell. She is the director of the Religious Liberty Program at the Institute on Religion and Democracy. She's been involved for many years with the Church Alliance for New Sudan and has really been involved in a lot of human rights issues. Matter of fact, has been a board member, advisor with various groups dealing with religious liberty, human rights issues, and also was involved in a task force that helped pass laws to protect victims of international sex trafficking. This particular piece is concerning, and as I pointed out, Ben Shapiro today in his piece said, no, it's not un-American to prefer Christian refugees to Muslim refugees. Faith, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Oh, you're very welcome, Kerby. It's good to be with you.
The ratio is way off. We have on this program for a number of years talked about the need to support more than $50,000, which we've sent to the Cradle Fund to help those Christian refugees in refugee camps. We hear hardly anything about it, but now, of course, we're hearing a lot about Muslim refugees. But as your article points out, and other articles have as well, we very rarely have Christian refugees make it to this country. And part of it has to do with the United Nations. It has to do with some of those Christian groups. So tell us what's going on.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly the problem. It's way out of balance. In the past 4 years or so, of the Syrian refugees accepted into the United States, which was about 2,000, only 53 were Christians, which is 2.5% of the total amount of refugees, but 10% of all Syrians are Christians. So this is way out of balance, and additionally, only one Yazidi person was accepted in, and the Yazidis are another religious minority group that are facing terrible persecution, and of course we've heard of what ISIS has done, taking Yazidi girls and women and making them into sex slaves, and also young boys, I would add. So this is a horrific situation, and the U.S., sadly, between the State Department and these refugee resettlement groups are not doing anything to help the Christians. And in fact, the president has said, we're not going to do a religious test, inferring that we're more interested in bringing in Christians than anybody else when we haven't brought in the Christians.
Well, and again, what we find is there's sort of a catch-22. Can you explain that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. The people who are in Iraq and Syria, the Christians who have had to flee from their homes because of ISIS coming into their towns and attacking and marking their houses, as we've seen in the pictures with the N, the Arabic N for Nazarene, they have fled. But unfortunately, they can't end up in the refugee camps, the UN refugee camps, because ISIS sends killers into those refugee camps, particularly to target the Christians or to kidnap them. So, but besides that, some of their fellow refugees would continue to persecute them as well. So they're not in the camps, and that is where the UN is getting its pool of applicants for asylum from. The UN only goes after people who are in the refugee camps to give them applications for asylum. And unfortunately, the U.S. groups that work with the UN to resettle people aren't protesting that. They're just going along with what the UN and the Obama administration tells them to do, which is to get applications to people in the refugee camps. So the Christians are left out of this situation completely.
I might just mention for our listeners, since we obviously talk about some of the political implication, there is a bill, H.R. 4017, Save Christians from Genocide Act, and actually it applies not only to the Christians but to the Yazidis that we just talked about a minute ago by Dana Rohrabacher. We'll talk more about that a little bit later, but I just wanted to mention that there are some changes that we can make that would be helpful, but a lot of this has to do with the need to actually resettle the refugees. And another individual we've had on this program before, Michael McCall, you quote from him, introduced a bill to protect the nation from terrorists by strengthening the screening process. That's one of the concerns, Faith, that people have right now. We would be glad to have Syrian refugees or Iraqi refugees here. We would certainly love to have more Christian refugees because, again, some of those individuals are ones we share a great deal of faith and commitment with. But the vetting process is a real concern. And so can you speak to that issue since you've written about it in your article?
Yes, the vetting process is pretty much non-existent when it comes to Syrians. And the director of the FBI, as well as the director of Homeland Security and the director of the National Defense Intelligence Agency have all said the same thing. We have no way to vet these Syrians. When it came to Iraqis, we had that ability because people had their fingerprints marked when they voted, for one thing. And we had all kinds of background resources on people, but we have nothing on the Syrians. And the administration is making light of that, but there are members of Congress who are very concerned about that, as well as many governors in our states who are very concerned about that. So, as you say, some of the bills would try to let the Christians have at least some level playing ground. I mean, when people say, well, you want to discriminate, no, it's already been a very discriminatory process against Christians, and we would just like to give some fair balance to be part of that refugee resettlement and to be people who would not be dangerous to us.
Again, you mentioned they've made light of that. That's a nice way of saying it. When the president was asked about this, he immediately got bristled and he said, well, the Republicans who were first afraid of the press, which I guess meant the Republican debate, are now afraid of 3-year-old orphans, and just completely ridiculed these ideas. And of course, I mentioned Dana Rohrabacher's bill, H.R. 4017, Save Christians from Genocide Act. And of course, I also mentioned Michael McCall's bill that you have in your particular article, the Refugee Resettlement Oversight and Security Act, H.R. 3573. And these, I think, are very legitimate concerns that not only the American people have, but these members of Congress have about bringing in tens of thousands of people from Syria, for which we have no ability to adequately vet them. And also, it's 12 times more expensive to bring them here than to keep them in refugee camps, with the hope that maybe some of them will be able to go back to their ancient lands once we maybe are able to destroy ISIS. Of course, that's a big question as well. Let's take a break, though. We have one of those mandatory breaks. We'll continue our conversation with Faith McDonnell. She is the director of the Religious Liberty Program at the Institute on Religion and Democracy. IRD does such a good job, and certainly we wanted you to know about her article, and it's posted on our website, pointofview.net. Perhaps you have comments about this refugee issue. You might give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Everyone agrees that we need government to regulate various parts of our society. In fact, the Constitution sets forth some of the vital functions for the government. But I also think that most of us believe that there are too many government regulations. Peter Roth, writing in the U.S. News and World Report, puts it this way. Existing regulations are sometimes unnecessary, frequently in conflict, and are enforced by bureaucracies that have lost sight of their original mission. Instead, they seek to ensure the right tickets are punched and the proper boxes are checked, as though they alone can guarantee consumer safety, economic competition, and financial market stability. There is an economic cost we end up paying to comply with all these regulations. Think of the amount of time many of us spend in filling out our income taxes. Now multiply that by hundreds and thousands of hours. You can begin to see one cost of regulation, and that does not even count the number of efficient ways we could produce a product or service if there weren't government regulations preventing a simpler way of producing it. Peter Roth says there's really no way to determine the total annual cost of the regulatory burden. Some groups have tried to get an estimate on the cost, and they have done it in a way that drives the point home to each of us. In previous commentaries, I've talked about the cost of government day. This is the date at which the average American has paid his share of the financial burden imposed by the spending and regulation that occurs at the federal, state, and local levels. That date usually lands in July. In other words, you spend more than half the year working to pay for the cost of taxes and the cost of all regulations. It's time for Congress to study the regulatory burden that regulations and regulators put on individuals and businesses. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Talking with Faith McDonnell. I want to get back to that in just a minute, but I thought I'd just give you an update. Yesterday we pointed out that even though you have 27 state governors who say they would refuse to accept Syrian refugees, it turns out they cannot actually refuse. And so there's been an interesting set of developments in the last 24 hours. A number of governors were on a phone call, and this included several governors from Republican Party, but also some Democrats as well. For example, those of us listening from New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan, as from California, Governor Jerry Brown, and they were actually pressing the administration to share information about the refugees entering, and they wanted notifications whenever the refugees were resettled in their states. So number one, the federal government is saying, no, state governors, you cannot actually prevent these refugees from coming to your state. Number two, we won't tell you when they are coming or where we're going to resettle them. No, I mean, not necessarily. They may on occasion, but we just talked about those in Louisiana. Bobby Jindal, who just dropped out of the presidential race, of course, is the governor of Louisiana. They found out in that case of those 10 that were actually resettled in Louisiana from the news. And, of course, as I pointed out yesterday, one of those, we've lost track of him. I hope his last name is not Sarnoff, but we'll get to that in just a minute. Faith, there's another part of this that is important. And one of the themes that Marlon Maddox had when he was the host of this program was follow the money. And in this article, you talk about these voluntary agencies. They're called Volgogs or whatever. And yet you point out something that when you start looking at the fact that some of these Christian groups oppose the proposal to maybe put Iraqi and Syrian Christians in front of the line, that may be due to the fact that they actually profit enormously from the resettling of these refugees in where the federal government might choose to resettle them. And so what are the financial implications of all of this?
Well, as you say, follow the money. There is definitely a financial implication, and the more refugees that get resettled, the more money that these organizations get. Now, they're doing some very good work with real refugees from around the world, but once you get into bed with the federal government, I think, you have to do what the federal government tells you to do. And I've heard from people who say that they are not sympathetic to, some of them are not sympathetic to a lot of this, but that they are under almost like a vow of confidentiality about what they're doing. They're under a federal mandate to keep quiet about this. So it really is not helping our Christian brothers and sisters at all. And as we were talking about the legislation, it was these VOLAGs, the voluntary agencies, that drafted a letter to members of Congress and recruited about 1,000 religious leaders, including many Christian leaders, many church pastors and people like that who said, we don't want there to be a religion test either. I mean, they didn't use those words, but considering what the president said, that's basically what they were saying. They were saying, our faith traditions tell us that to welcome all the aliens and sojourners and all of that. But they didn't mention at all any of the problems that were involved with this. So, they pressured Congress, and we may see that come out in any kind of legislation that ever does get passed. I really hope that Congressman Rohrabacher's bill goes through, but they're being pressured, all members of Congress, by this letter that they got from 1,000 faith leaders saying, we don't want there to be any discrimination against anybody.
Well, again, the only group that seems to be discriminated against are the Christians. I mean, again,
Exactly.
When you have 2,000 Muslim refugees from Syria and only 53 from Christian, you can figure that one out. But you pointed out they didn't mention the abuses. They also didn't mention something else, the number. In the original draft, it talked about 100,000 Syrian refugees. That was omitted from the final draft. But we have listeners in the state of Illinois. Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois, he's on the floor of the Senate urging that those 100,000 Syrians be accepted. Now, there's a disconnect here, Faith, because we're hearing a lot of people talk about 10,000, and that's, I think, too many right there. But 10,000 and 100,000, that's an order of magnitude difference. And even though that got left off the letter, that's what basically these groups are calling for. True?
That's right. That's what they're calling for. That's what they're working towards in many different ways. They're working with the UNHCR, the High Commissioner for Refugees, to try to change the actual definition of what a refugee is, which has always been someone who has a well-founded and credible fear of persecution, to things like being a climate refugee.
Oh, here we go. It's just, I mean, you just cannot make this stuff up, and it's just unbelievable. Well, again, your article here is very well written, and I think it would be just eye-opening to some of our listeners, so I wanted to make that available on the website. And just before we take some phone calls and let you go, I wanted you to talk about what you're doing there at the Institute on Religion and Democracy, because you've kind of broken a story here that we mentioned yesterday, but I think we've gotten into a little more detail, and it sort of answers the question, because I think really, Faith, some people are thinking, why do all these people want to bring these Syrian refugees here in the first place? Well, there are some economic benefits to certain groups, and there may be some political advantages, and all of a sudden you begin to understand why they are very critical of anybody who says, well, wait a minute, maybe we should vet those. Oh, no, you don't have compassion, or you don't, you're not showing the love of Christ. How can you dare say this? When we actually, once we start investigating this, recognize there's a whole lot more going on that is not even being covered very well by the mainstream press.
That's right. And I would like to say to those people who say that we're not being compassionate, where is their compassion for the refugees who are Christians, who have come into this country and are then again in danger because of us bringing people in? There was a case in August this past August of a Christian refugee from Africa who was tortured and slaughtered in his own house by 3 refugees from Somalia. This was in Portland, Maine.
Well, and again, I think you just recognize that one of the reasons why Christian refugees do not go to these particular refugee camps run by the United Nations is because they recognize that that's a place where they might be slaughtered. Of course, we've shown pictures in the past and talked with Johnny Moore about some of those that have been in refugee camps that have been a little more sympathetic towards Christians, where they even have crosses on their tents and other things. But just even if you come to the land of opportunity, the United States, there's no guarantee that you won't be persecuted or even martyred here in this country. So, Faith, you've just done a great job of investigating this, and we'd love to call on you again. But thank you for the great work that you do there at the Institute for Religion and Democracy.
Oh, thank you, Kerby. I appreciate it very much, and I'd love to be with you anytime.
Well, again, those articles that we've talked about are available on our website. In particular, this one by Faith McDonnell came out in the stream. U.S. Christian groups are prioritizing Muslim refugees over Christian ones. Like we said, only 53 Christian refugees. Now, think about the battle. First of all, ISIS going into Iraq. Think then of the civil war in Syria. And only 53 have made it to the United States. That alone should tell you quite a bit. And, of course, we've just pointed out that the phone call yesterday with the White House, with some of the governors, including people like Governor Jerry Brown, are saying, well, wait a minute, you're going to put these in our state, but you're not going to tell us? Or the federal government's going to tell us where those refugees are going to go, and some of these groups are actually getting financial benefit from that. So again, if you'd like to join the conversation, we would love to hear your comments. 1-800-351-1212. Let's head out to California first. Avi, you have the floor.
Hey, I'm on the air?
You are on the air.
Awesome. I just want to say that there's a wise word of Elie Wiesel that the opposite of love is not hate but indifference. And I think radical Islam is a horrible, horrible plague that's hurting the world at large. And I think the way you combat it isn't by saying, hey, we can't let any refugees in. But, you know, we have so many different new things at our disposal, like Facebook and Twitter. Why don't you make any refugee that wants to come in here have to denounce radical Islam or something like that publicly?
It's interesting, yeah, because then that would be more than just, well, I'll just lie to you and say that, oh, I'm a Christian, or, oh, that I'm a moderate Muslim or something like that. That's got some merit to it. We unfortunately have to take a break. We'll come back and take some more phone calls. We'll have an open line this last half hour. There are all sorts of things I'd like to cover, but we've already covered some of those. Some of the things we've learned about the governors, 27, who say, I don't really want these Muslims, especially these ones that are from Syria, where we really don't know who they are, exactly where they're coming from, and what they want to do when they get here in our state. And the federal government saying, that's too bad. They're going to put them where we're going to put them, and you can't stop us. Well, there are some ideas about how to stop them, and that's one of the reasons why we encourage you to visit our website and click on that action item. We'll be right back.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Let me just mention, in case some of you missed it yesterday, we did talk about the fact that there may be some ways to begin to stem this tide. And one of those, which many of you have responded to, was our Take Action item, block ISIS terrorists posing as Syrian refugees. And one of those is to talk about various points of legislation or funding to maybe defund some of this. The others that we've mentioned today, as we talked with Faith McDonnell, and one of those is in her article, and that is actually sponsored by Representative Michael McCall from the state of Texas. And that is the Refugee Resettlement Oversight and Security Act. That's H.R. 3573. Another one I mentioned just briefly, and we'll get into that maybe later in the week, from Representative Dana Rohrabacher from California, H.R. 4017, Save Christians from Genocide Act. So those are just a couple of ways in which we can respond. And if you have not taken the time to visit our Take Action item on our website, pointofview.net, a few hundred of you have, and certainly there is room for many more of you to contact your representative and express your opinion about this issue. 1-800-351-1212 is your way to express your opinion on air, and going to pointofview.net is your way to express your opinion to your elected representative. Let's take some phone calls. We'll start off with Eric in Georgia. Eric, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, how you doing?
Very good.
Good. Hey, I was just concerned about the discussion about whether or not accepting from Syria or not. The vast majority of people in Syria are Muslim, so the amount of people that are Christian in Syria that would be coming over is going to be overwhelmingly Muslim.
It's about 90% to 10%. So again, we have about 10% of Syria that identify themselves as Christian, and we have about 2% in round numbers that actually have made it over to the United States. And so, you know, if the numbers were like in the 200s, out of 200s compared to 2,000, that would work. But when the number is 53, it doesn't work very well. I mean, it's very obvious that they're getting over. Yeah.
I agree, but the ones that are coming over or trying to come over are vastly Muslim and not Christian. Obviously, there's some kind of miscalculation in the overall generalization to discuss that.
No, I mean, you got to recognize that we've talked about what is already here. Some of these individuals have been processed over a fairly long period of time. So in some respects, the first ones to try to come were the Christians because the Christians were targeted. I need to probably explain that again because that's something that I think a lot of people haven't been aware of. We've talked about that before, but it's important. And that is when ISIS, or even when the midst of that Syrian civil war took place, oftentimes, especially ISIS will go into a region. And we saw this in Iraq and Mosul, and we've seen this in Fallujah. We've also seen this in Syria. And they mark the house with the Arabic letter N. And probably you've seen that. It looks like kind of a U, all sort of, but that's the way it looks in Arabic. And the reason they use the letter N is to actually describe them as Nazarene. And so they're already targeted long before some of the other Muslims have left the conflict. So in the first wave, it was almost all Christians. As a matter of fact, when we raised some of the funds for the Cradle Fund, we're talking about a very significant number of those early refugee camps, which were actually Christian. So when you come down to this, and you only have 53, first of all, that's the first issue. Second of all, of course, as Faith points out, it isn't just looking at the numbers, 2% compared to at least 10% of Christians. It has to do with the fact that there are actually various settlements, and there's even a picture in one of the articles we've posted here where you can just see this vast acreage here of this refugee camp, and that one happens to be in Jordan, where there are just so many individuals, but they're almost exclusively Muslim because Christians won't go into those particular camps, especially run by the United Nations, because they will be persecuted, maybe even martyred while they go to that refugee camp. So there are some structural problems with even the way this is done, and a lot of that has to do with the United Nations, and of course we mentioned some of that yesterday, and the fact that a lot of individuals are willing to go along. But back to the point, 53 out of the thousands so far that have come and more coming. And of course, that's just a small representation because we talked about just the number of Syrians that are already here from previous waves that have come over. It just illustrates again that there are a lot of people that are saying, well, we'd be a little more likely to bring in Christian refugees rather than Muslim refugees. But as one of our callers pointed out yesterday, just because somebody calls themselves a Christian, we're not even sure about them either. So lots of issues to address, but let's go back to the phones and stay in the state of Georgia and go to Henry on the Good News Network. What would you add to our conversation today?
Yeah, Mr. Madison, thank you for taking my call. What I'm concerned about is police officers, jails, hospitals, babies being born, and mental institutions. The taxpayers will have to pick up that bill. Is that right?
Of course, you get to pay for all of that. Not to mention the fact you get to pay for all the resettlement, if you think about it. And as I've said, some people have told me, and I haven't looked at the numbers, but I have heard it enough to believe that it's probably an accurate statistic, because this comes from members of Congress, that it's 12 times more expensive to bring a refugee over here and resettle him or her than it is to keep them in the country. And you've got to recognize that right now you do have some of these refugee camps. I mentioned the one in Jordan because we've got a picture of it there, but in Turkey and Lebanon and a few places. Of course, you have people pouring into Europe right now. So when you add all of that up, we've got a huge humanitarian crisis, but establishing refugee there, I think, are going to be much more effective. And this is something else that I'd like to talk about in the future, because we've got some very good material that has come out, interestingly enough, from the Heritage Foundation and the Daily Signal, what a responsible Syrian refugee policy looks like for the United States after Paris attacks. And it's written by James Carafano and others who have served previous administrations, for example, in the Reagan or Bush administration. And they have a much better plan than the one of bringing in 100,000 Syrian refugees. And basically, Henry, as you point out, we get to pay for all of that, don't we?
Yeah, isn't it going to put a strain on the taxpayers to pick up all this stuff?
Oh, I think so. And the bottom line is that the federal government may pay for some of that, but I suspect that before it's all through, the states are paying for it. And that's why it's not just now 27 governors, only one of which is a Democrat. All their others are Republicans. It's not just Republican governors. Now you're starting to have some others like California, Jerry Brown and others on these phone calls going, now tell me again what's going to happen here, and tell me where it's going to happen, and tell me what expenses we're going to have to incur. I suspect you will find the expenses coming to the states, and you'll get to pay for them through your state income tax or your property tax or something like that.
I can't believe that our people we elect I can't believe they haven't thought about all this. Maybe they have. I don't know.
Well, I think you better ask them. I mean, some of them are going to be coming home on this Thanksgiving break. And I just want to encourage every listener to point of view. You know, members of Congress are going to come home. They're going to vote on Friday, and they may vote on one of these issues, maybe Dana Rohrabacher's bill, H.R. 4017, or Michael McCall's bill, H.R. 3573. But then after Friday, they're all on an airplane and they're coming home. So next week, you have an opportunity to express your opinion to your elected representative face to face. And say, have you thought about any of this?
I'm appalled at the government saying that you're going to take them regardless. I mean, that's President Obama's thing, you know. You're going to have it regardless. So, is it constitutional for the government to override states' wishes? like that?
Well, the sad reality is it goes all the way back to the Refugee Act of 1980. I don't want to get into the deep weeds here, but it does give the president the right to admit refugees who face persecution, quote, persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group or political opinion, unquote. So the president has that authority. And then, of course, this phone call here, one of the individuals after the phone call said this. Again, this is direct quotes in Bloomberg. You can read it for yourself. There was a real sense of frustration from all the governors that there was just a complete lack of transparency and communication coming from the federal government. Now, when you start having Republicans and Democratic governors saying that, you know that there's something that's up, and maybe there's another agenda. I certainly tried to give you a little bit of a behind-the-scenes look from Faith McDonnell. Why would people want to bring them in? Well, some of these particular groups, which are called VOLAGs, which are the volunteer agencies, may actually benefit financially from some of the locations that are picked and some of the kind of services that are provided. So, as we've said on this program before, follow the money. Well, we'll take a break. We'll take some more phone calls right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
You know, Tony Perkins in his piece yesterday, Washington Update, did address some of those issues, especially how to think about this from a Christian point of view. First of all, he pointed out that CNS News actually pointed out that only 53 of the almost 2,200 Syrian refugees were actually Christian. And then pointed out, he said, obviously not every Muslim coming to America wants to kill us, but so far those who want to kill us are Muslim. He says that's an uncomfortable reality even for the church. There seems to be a growing chorus of Christians who justify these open-door policies on immigration or asylum with the biblical command to love the stranger. He says, I agree we should love the stranger, but that doesn't mean that we have to do it at the expense of our own security. The president's chief responsibility is to protect Americans from all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's our job then as individuals to show love and compassion, and there are plenty of charitable solutions for refugees that don't involve bringing them to America unchecked and unaccountable. One option would be to make their homeland safe while we offer as much humanitarian relief as possible. I might point out that a lot of what we've done to raise funds for the Cradle Fund would be to then actually minister to those individuals who have pastors in those communities, because they have the desire to really go back to this homeland. This is the first time, really, that you have not had Christian communities there. Some of the oldest Christian communities in the world come from the lands of Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, and Rebekah. But anyway, Tony Perkins goes on to say, our nation can be a caring and benevolent without unnecessarily endangering our own people. What many forget is that in Scripture, loving the neighbor is just one component. God also commands that these foreigners to assimilate and keep the laws of the land. As Exodus 12:49 makes clear, there shall be one law for the native and for the stranger who sojourns among you. The United States goal should be a safe haven for everyone, and that means protecting the refugees' shelter abroad without sacrificing ours at home. Let's get a few more of your comments here. If you would like to join us, 1-800-351-1212, and we'll go to Mark in Texas, KBJS. What would you like to say?
Well, I hope I can articulate this well enough, but back during the war, way back when, people don't talk much about it. The young folks don't remember it, but there was a time when we were at war against Japan. And our government was concerned about our safety here at home. And they gathered people up that they perceived that could be a threat. Not that were, but that could be. And they did this for two reasons. First, to protect us, and also it protected those people, because when a country is at war, which if we're not at war, I don't know what the definition is.
Yeah, and again, there's a sad history of the Japanese internment camps, and I think, and you're the second person to mention this in 2 days. I just don't see any interest at all on the part of Congress on this, and you know, there's not even a snowflake's chance that this president would even allow something like that. But back to the point, if we can't do that in this country, and I think that's politically impossible, can we at least then allow refugee camps in other countries, like where already we have some of those in a few particular locations, and there are few and far between, because I see one of our callers wants to point out that really it hasn't been exactly the willingness on the part of too many countries other than Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon to do that. And as Ben Shapiro points out, it isn't because it's out of the goodness of their heart. It's just because they recognize how difficult it would be to put up fences and machine guns to keep people out. But
exactly. Go ahead. If I was in the same situation that these people were in, I would much rather be in a safe place here in Texas as I would be having to flee the place that I grew up and knew and felt comfortable in, and, you know, my home. And those people, I know they don't want to be running.
Yep.
You know, that's not what they want to do. They want to live their life.
Again, and I'm not saying that this might not be an option. The reality is the political winds are not blowing that way. And the other point is as soon as you put a camp in Texas, let's pick a good example there, you know what's going to happen next. The ACLU is going to say, wait a minute, we can't keep them there. They can't be incarcerated there. They need full rights. We need to put them on a path to citizenship, because after all, they need to be able to vote in the next election. You know, it just goes down that road, and we know very quickly. It's one of the reasons why we actually put terrorist prisoners in Gitmo rather than here in the United States. And again, Mark, you raised a good question. You're not the first one. As a matter of fact, I'm sure there are others will talk about it, but just don't see Congress interested in that. And there is no chance that this president at least would do something like that. So let's give a few more of you just a chance to join the conversation before we run out of time. So let's go to California, KYCC. Don, you have the floor.
Hey, Kerby. You kind of mentioned it. I would like to hear some of the Republican candidates bring up the very real missing ingredient here. Where are all these loving Muslim countries that should be taking in their fellow Muslims? How come Saudi Arabia and some of these other countries? Not a one. I don't hear a peep, nor do I hear our leadership calling on them. Let's put Saudi Arabia on the carpet and say, why aren't you volunteering to take your fellow Muslims? You know, there's a difference between Islam and Christianity here. You mentioned earlier, love your neighbor. Who's doing that?
Well, again, like I said, the only reason you have these refugee camps in places like Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon are simply because it just is physically and politically impossible for them to keep them out. It isn't out of the goodness of the heart, even of those countries. They just got overrun, and so they tried to find a way to manage it. And again, if people want to understand the extent of this problem, go to our website, and the article by Faith McDonnell, if you print out the original, you'll have to click through. There is a picture there. Of course, you can go to Wikipedia and find it as well. And Don, we are talking about acres. I mean, like miles and miles of tents. This is incredible.
Their fellow Muslims, they should assimilate quite well into Saudi Arabia life, right?
No, they should.
You would think.
Yeah, you and I having fun with this, but there's not a chance that's going to happen.
That's right.
And again, this is something a president that is taking control of the situation would do. And just simply, and as I've said before, when people keep saying, well, we need to bring more here, I go, wait a minute. And especially when the Europeans say that, I say, wait a minute, you first. I mean, really, you first. We have been taking in people from all over the world. And if you go into some of these homeless shelters, you go into some of the churches that have outreaches to people of different languages, you recognize we are a melting pot people. But we have been taking in at least 1 million people legally every year, sometimes anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million people illegally every year. And then to say, oh, let's just bring another 100,000 in. That's what Dick Durbin at least was talking about from the Senate floor the other day. There's a point at which we want to say, Europe, you weren't taking any of the ones in. Well, we were taking them all in. Maybe it's your turn. Or back to the point that Don so aptly pointed out, you Arab countries, some of which are awash in oil, you take them in and you provide some of the welfare benefits and you provide some of the resettlement. But more importantly, let's defeat ISIS so some of these individuals come back to their homelands, which is where they would like to be in the first place. Well, we're simply out of time. And those of you that didn't get through, well, there's always tomorrow. But let me just mention that if you haven't taken the opportunity to contact your member of Congress, we've made it very easy. Go to our website, pointofview.net. Click on that button that says Take Action, block ISIS terrorists posing as Syrian refugees, and you can actually just type in your name and address. It will surface your representative. Even if you don't know what it is, the computer will help you find that. And then you can look at the note we have there. You can change it, modify it however you want, hit send, and then you've done your civic duty. We have a lot more to talk about, and that's why we're going to postpone that till tomorrow. And we'll follow some of these pieces of legislation making their way through Congress. But that's all we have for today. If you'd like to find out more or listen to the broadcast again, go to our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Chris. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
This time of year, it seems everyone's looking for a better, more affordable healthcare solution. But with costs rising and options limited, where do you turn? If you're a Christian, you turn to Medishare. It's not insurance. It's over 154,000 believers who share each other's medical bills. It's about half the cost of healthcare insurance programs. And it's fully acceptable under the law. Best of all, Medishare is based on the timeless principles found in God's Word. You never pay for things that go against your beliefs. Medishare is healthcare that fits your family and your faith.
Learn how thousands of Christians can help you save on your health care. For your free information guide, call 844-45-BIBLE. Not available in Montana. Medishare, affordable biblical health care. Call 844-45-BIBLE. That's 844-45-BIBLE.
A big thank you to members of Truth Team 360. You make this program possible. Not a member yet? Join today at pointofview.net. Click on Donate Now and become a monthly partner. Pointofview.net.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.